Welcome to the Intentional Encourager podcast, where each episode brings you compelling conversations and stories designed to entertain, enlighten, and encourage. And now here's your host, Brian Sexton.
And welcome into the Intentional Encourager podcast. I'm your host, Brian Sexton. Thank you for joining us again today. I have a fire starter. Now, if you're anywhere near something flammable, you might want to move. If you live near a wooded area, you might want to listen to this away from the wooded area, because when a fire starter is here, things are liable to burn up. I'm telling you, this lady is a fire starter. She has a 17-year career in government relations as an executive for a large international nonprofit, and she is wanting to introduce folks to the great me set. We're going to talk about all those things in the next few minutes with Terri Broussard Williams, who joins me today on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Terri, how are you today?
Hello. Thank you so much for having me today.
Terri, let's start here. Everyone has had a different experience the last 18 months. I live in West Virginia. We have the smallest population, one of the smallest populations in the United States. We have dealt with the pandemic in a far different way than in New York City or Texas or a lot of the hot spots, things like that. We just have. It's just a different pace here, a different lifestyle here in Appalachia than it is in a lot of the urban areas in this country. What have you learned from the last 18 months or so about life and business that's going to be a continued lesson that you take with you throughout the remainder of your career?
Absolutely. I do think that everyone's had a different experience. I had the opportunity during the pandemic to travel to different parts of the country safely, of course, with lots of hand sanitizer and masks. But everyone has experienced something different. For me, I actually got a head start on everyone else. In September of 2019, I was at an event actually lobbying, and a sofa came down on my head. It was this freak accident where someone lifted a couch and it just hit me in the head.
Wow.
And so it's crazy. It sounds crazy, but it was just this weird thing that happened in my life. And so for 3 months, I was at home. I could not work. I could not use a phone or a computer. I was just sitting on my couch, ironically, the sofa landed on my head, but then I became centered on my sofa at home. And during that time, I realized that I was on this hamster wheel of work and life and just moving really fast. And, was a board member, was a wife, a sister, a friend, just everything to everyone else and nothing to myself.
You were quarantined before quarantining was cool.
That's right.
And so I've got to ask you this, because I've heard people talk, I've heard leadership experts talk about this. If you don't take care of certain aspects of your life, then at some point life will force you to take care of those, like your health, your finances, your spiritual walk with the Lord, other things like that. When you had that accident, after the initial trauma and shock, maybe after the first week or two or something like that, and you came to the settling realization that this was going to be your life for the next couple of months or so, take me through the thought processes that you had being centered on your couch, so to speak. And it's ironic that a sofa caused the accident, and then you're basically either bed, you're in bed a lot and things like that. What was going through your mind and some of the emotions you were dealing with having that sedentary lifestyle for 2 or 3 months while you were recovering?
Yes. And it takes us to the point that you were making earlier in the question that you asked earlier. So I learned rest for the first time. I graduated from college in 3 years, started working full time while in college. I was just on this hamster wheel. So I learned rest. I was still for the first time. I had not been still, probably since middle school. Yeah. And I learned grace for myself. And so those three things really anchored the way that I began to look in the world. And I think that's happening for so many people right now, right?
Yeah.
The world is having this great reset. And so I believe it's allowing us to have a great me set. For the first time in our lives, we are taking inventory of what matters to us, within our communities, on the ground, within our workplaces. How do we want to show up at work? Do we even want to show up at work? And inside, we're all experiencing emotions that maybe we hadn't felt before, and we are choosing the lens in which we want to see the world and how we're moving. And so I call those things the great me set. I am learning to put myself first. And when I put myself first, I can lead more authentically. I can live more happily. I can be more healthy.
Yeah, I love that, because I understand what you're talking about there, because I wanted to do a podcast for a good while, and the pandemic was a perfect opportunity to do it because I had some extra time and finished my book, which I had extra time. And so I understand that when you talk about defining the great me set, because a lot of people, and again, that's why I asked the question the way I did, was a lot of people would tell you, maybe a small business owner would tell you, they've had the greatest year or the greatest 18 months of their life because they were forced to do things differently. As you were talking about getting off the hamster wheel. Some would tell you it's been terrible. Some have lost loved ones through it, things like that. What are you hearing from folks that you work with around their own personal me set? Are you hearing that it was an eye-opening revelation, or are you hearing the exact opposite? Are you hearing, hey, Terri, I feel what you're saying, but boy, oh boy, I wish I had a time machine. I could go back to 2019 and then time jump away from these last 18 months because they have been terrible. What are you hearing about folks that have had those personal experiences like that?
I think life takes us on a journey, and what you have gained from the last 18 months depends on who you are and where you are in that journey. So the people who saw it as an opportunity to get reconnected to their home life or their family or their business, they are rocking and rolling, right? They are more innovative. They are more generative before, or than before they were I'm married before COVID. I couldn't get those.
Hey, I make all kinds of speaking mistakes and people still listen to me. So you're just fine. Go right ahead.
You are catching me after a very long weekend and after
that's why you'll catch me sipping some hot tea during while you're talking. I'll sip some hot tea with a little coffee in it because I need that pick me up as well, Terri. It's
I've never heard of that. I've never heard of putting coffee in your tea or tea in your coffee, and I haven't had either this morning.
Terri, that was a part of the pandemic me set for myself. That came from my me set was I hated coffee. I never put coffee in my tea, but I wanted something to balance the sweetness of the honey because I put raw honey in it for the health benefits, and I wanted something to balance the sweetness of it, so that's why I put a little coffee and a little extra caffeine to kind of perk me up. So that came from my me set from 2020 was the coffee, tea, and honey combination.
Nice. And actually what you saw is a symptom of my recovery from a major concussion. My brain just doesn't work the same as it did before.
Can I take you in Terri, do you mind? I'm sorry. Can I take you there for just a second? If you don't mind, I want to shift that because you went through a major life event like a lot of other people have gone through a major life event that have had COVID. I know people that have had COVID that had it and recovered 2 or 3 months ago that are still experiencing side effects from it. And you just mentioned your concussion was nearly 2 years ago and you're still not all the way there. How do you this is why I wanted to, and forgive me for interrupting you, but this is why I wanted to kind of cut you mid-sentence there. You said something important. What I took from that is you're learning to live with how you are now, how your recovery is ongoing. And a lot of folks are in that same boat. What have you learned about recovery that you may not have known before or perceived before, and learning with living with the adjustments that you've had to make in life. I think that's really important to discover what you did and the adjustments you've made around how you're recovering and still recovering.
Sure. I will answer that, but I want to tell you a story. So I started painting with oil and watercolors and sketching at the age of 5. I got real legit art instruction from a painter that was from Italy. And she recently passed away. And I learned this great lesson from her that I don't know if I fully understood it until she passed away just last month. And her name was Savannah Borg. She was she's the grandmother of actually someone that was on American Idol, Mackenzie Borg. They're just this beautiful artistic family. And so Miss Savannah would notice that I was like gripping my pencil really tight and trying to like write my name perfectly or get the lines perfect when I was sketching. And, when you sketch for art, you want the lines to be like have flow and just be really light so you can paint over them. So what she would do is she would give me a raw egg and tell me to draw on that egg. And that was her way of getting me to kind of let go. And if I drew too hard, I end up with yolk in my egg or egg yolk in my hands, right?
Yeah.
And so when I think back to that lesson, and I did, as I pinned a note to her husband about what she meant to me, it took me back to that me set. And so before my concussion, I had to nail things. They had to be perfect. If a meeting started at 10, it needed to start at 9:59. I was striving to check the boxes for everything. And, I go back to those 3 things I mentioned to you. The first was just being still. Like, it is okay to be still, so yesterday when I was on the plane taking off to come home, I just put on my iPhone and my earbuds and just listened to music instead of like trying to bang out some emails in my phone. I was just still. The other thing was I learned rest, so, again, going back to that airplane before my concussion, I would clean out the inbox, in either my work computer or my personal computer. Yesterday, I took a nap on the plane. And I also just learned grace, how to just give yourself the forgiveness that you give to others. When someone is late for a meeting, what do you tell them? No problem, right? Or if someone says they missed a deadline, you're like, it's okay, you can get it to me tomorrow.
Yeah.
But when it's yourself, you don't extend that grace to yourself to say, it is okay to go to bed at 9:00 tonight and just be silent in bed and meditate, or just to have a moment in prayer if you choose to, to pray. So those are the things that I took away, rest, still, and grace. And they've extended to every part of my life. And so, I don't mind letting everyone see that maybe I have a hiccup in my thinking and can't think of that perfect word. I can now, as I wanted to say, the way people feel before the pandemic. But before, I would get so caught up in missing that word that I would walk away thinking that you and I didn't have a good conversation. But so you just learn to adapt and see things differently. And, if you allow me to pivot, I think the way that we can continue to have those me set moments where we can honor ourselves, we first have to breathe. I call that the first step in this thought process. Just take a moment to breathe. And then second, you have to visualize the end goal. So if you want to create a movement in your community, what does that look like? What is the goal that you're achieving? Or if you want to have a behavior change within yourself, if you want to let go of some of that perfectionism, what does that feel like? You have to visualize it. Then the third step is you want to begin to attract the people that you might need to make that happen, the tools that you might need, the moments that you might need. You have to attract those things so that you are in position to make them happen. And then last, the fourth step is you have to transform. So I had to be okay with letting that egg crack in my hand to become a better painter, or I had to be okay with just resting on the plane yesterday to be energized and ready to go for you today without coffee or tea. So breathe, visualize, attract, and transform. And those are the elements of honoring that great me set.
Well, the coffee just kind of kickstarts everything, it just kind of makes it go. I'm, when we, my niece, my wife takes my niece to school. She goes to a Christian school, and my wife takes her to school. And she'll tell you when she hits the door, her uncle is up and engaged in conversation with her, because I want to kind of pre-educate her before the education really starts, So let's step aside, take a break. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit about Terri's book, Find Your Fire. We're going to talk a little bit about her book, Find Your Fire, and get into more great conversation. You stay with us. Terri Broussard Williams is my guest today on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Back in just a moment.
Hey everybody, Brian Sexton here. I want to tell you about our sponsor, SEO National. SEO stands for Search Engine Optimization. Now, what's that, you might say? Well, search engine optimization helps you show up higher on search engines in front of paying customers for words that you as a business owner can monetize. What a great concept. SEO National is owned by my good buddy Damon Burton, who's been a guest here on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Not only has Damon and his team worked with businesses of all sizes, from e-commerce startups to NBA teams and Shark Tank featured businesses, but more importantly, Damon and his team are about transparency, trust, and providing lifetime value. So much so that he still has his first customers after opening SEO National 14 years ago. Let me give you some intentional encouragement and call Damon and his team today at 855-736-6285 or go to www.seonational.com and get a free quote.
Terri, let's talk about Find Your Fire. Stories and strategies to inspire the change maker in you. Take me through that process of writing your book, because everybody has a different process. For me, mine was about 2.5 years, and then the pandemic just kind of jump-started. It was either now or never in my case. But for you, what was the impetus for you to write your book?
Yes, and I just moved my camera so y'all could see a little bit of that cover over there.
That a girl. Hey, bravo. Hey, we don't mind shameless plugs here on the Intentional Encourager podcast. We love it. We enjoy it.
That's why you call it the intentional, right? Intentional encourager.
We are, yes, we're very intentional. If you gave me a half a minute, I'd go grab my book and hold it up, but it's got a green cover and a green screen, so it's, it would just be a hot mess. But seriously, what was the impetus for your book?
Sure. So my undergraduate studies is in journalism, and I began working in television as a teen reporter at the age of 16. And when I look back at my life, that through line or that common theme is that I want to give people access to information, data, stories, information, so that they can do good in the world. And so, I transitioned from television news to lobbying around 2003. And the same skills that I used working in a television newsroom were the same skills that I used as a lobbyist. And I had a conversation just on Saturday with a journalist named Jessie Mitchell, who's at CBS, and she and I were talking about just how much you can inspire people when you give them what they need to do good. And so I began to see these themes in my life. If I was working to advance policy to state capital that might make the state smoke free, when I gave that power to the residents in that community instead of just holding it for myself, they looked energized. They looked happy, like they were at their best because they were transforming their communities. And so, I had this great career where it became really easy for me. I didn't have to think about it. I was being able to really transform communities around me. And so I wanted to give that power and those tips to others. Yeah. And going back to what you and I talked about earlier, you said, the universe will bring the things together for you when the time is right. If you have ideas swirling in your head, it will just create a stop so that you have that path. And so for me, I began writing my book before I had my concussion that we mentioned before your break. But when I had that concussion, I couldn't write, I couldn't be on my computer and I couldn't be at work. But I had this break in time where I had to ask myself what was the most important thing. And it was getting the story out. And so I moved from, keystrokes and tapping on a keyboard to recording on my phone and was able to crank my book out in just a matter of months. So when you put an intention out in the universe and you ask to encourage others, it always happens right on time.
I got to ask you this, because I was thinking as you were telling a little bit of your story about being in front of the camera and doing work that people see, right? And then being behind the scenes and doing lobbying and doing work that no one sees, because you're meeting with people daily. You're having lunch meetings. You're doing this. You're going from meeting to meeting. And a lot of meetings now have gone virtual. So literally nobody sees the work unless you're recording the conversation and things like that. Was that a hard transition for you? The reason I ask is I know people in television, in local television and things like that, who have been in been in front of the camera for decades. And I have a journalism background myself. I took 2 years of journalism at Marshall University. And so I understand the business well. Was that a hard transition for you to move from in front of the camera to behind the scenes?
Absolutely not. But I think it also depends on the person and how you draw your energy and what you need to get out of your own journey. I am an introvert. I much rather give someone that mic to hold so that they can be their best. I much rather teach someone how to accomplish a goal so that they can share their talents with the world.
Okay, so let me ask you this. How does an introvert by nature turn on the ability to be an extrovert? I'm an extrovert who's had to learn some introversion from being around my wife, who's very much an introvert. And now the older I've gotten, the more there are times I'm introverted myself. How did you flip that switch? Because there are people listening, I'm sure, that are saying, Terri, I feel you. I am not by nature an outgoing, out there person. I feel like I have a story to tell, but that's just not in my internal nature. How did you turn that on in your life to take that from the natural, innate part of what you were born with and what God gave you when you were born to just go, okay, I'm going to make myself become an extrovert? Because I would have never known, and I don't think the audience would have ever known, that was ever a part of your personality.
Yeah.
Because you just seem to be so natural and it just seems to flow out of you. How did you make that switch and that flip?
Right. So many people confuse skills and traits with preferences, right? So when you really look at the definition and that scientific explanation of being an introvert or an extrovert, it's truly how you draw your energy. It's not so much how you show up in the world. So you can still need moments where you are quiet and you are not around a lot of people and still have the skills and traits to show up and share a message. So for me, it might just be having a quiet moment before I walk on stage and speak to thousands of people, or even having a quiet moment before I do something like this. So before you and I recorded today, I had a meeting with my publicist. I stopped. I listened to Fall Out Boy, had a little dance, a moment by myself. And then I was able to show up here, right? But for me, if I did this at the end of the day, after a full day of lobbying or a full day of giving a keynote, then I might not be ready or desire to do this, right? Yeah. So you have to just think about how you stack that day based off your energy levels and what you need. And even if we were to do this at the end of the day, I might just have a 30-minute break where I was just answering emails or meditating or having a quiet moment to recharge to show up for you.
I've got to ask you this real quick. Let's step aside and take another break. I want to ask you about, if you're watching this on YouTube, I want to ask Terri about what's behind her, the saying that's behind her. Terri Broussard Williams is my guest. Come back with us here in just a moment. Hey everybody, Brian Sexton. Want to tell you about my new book, People Buy From People. 10 powerful people lessons from the ultimate people person, my dad. My dad was one of the greatest connectors that I ever knew. And he shared with me 10 connecting principles that I have used throughout my 25-year sales and sales management, customer engagement, and leadership career that I'm passing along to you. If you want to be a stronger, deeper, and more powerful connector, you've got to pick up a copy of People Buy From People. There are concepts in there that you may not realize help make you a power connector. You can go to Amazon and pick it up, Kindle if you're an e-reader and you like to do it that way, or now available on Audible. And there's one other way you can get a copy of People Buy From People. You can get one from me and I'll sign it for you. You go to intentionalmediaandpublishing@gmail.com and send me an email, and I'll share with you the link on how you can get a signed copy. You can buy a signed copy directly from me. Again, People Buy From People. If you want to connect like never before, pick up your copy today of People Buy From People. And now let's get back to more great conversation here on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Terri, behind you over your right shoulder is a saying that says, I believe leaders turn moments into movements. That is so good. And you were talking about those moments a minute ago where you grab 5 minutes just to get your mind in that right place, or you grab 30 minutes just to decompress and think about things. For me, traveling most of my career, the car was where I did a lot of those things. The car might have been, and in full disclosure, a lot of people will say, you're a natural at doing this and having conversation, but they don't see all the times I was in the car and just talked to myself and practiced saying what I wanted to say and doing it the way I wanted to do it, and kind of hosting a podcast where nobody was listening, just me in the car. Those moments turned into what you see now. Can you take me to a moment in your life that became a movement beyond you've talked about the Great Me Set, but can you take me to a moment in your life that became a movement in your life?
Yeah, but before I even talk about myself, I'll just share some, so people really understand the context. I tell everyone that movement makers or fire starters, they're everyday people. You don't need a pedigree to create change, but you do need to have a good work ethic, good intention, and a good heart. And I really believe that fire starters and movement makers are people who see things that others ignore, but they opt to take change. They take that first step. And so when we think of some of the greatest movements of our life, there were leaders who had that one moment where they might have delivered a great speech and a movement came from it. And oftentimes those movements aren't for the people that they knew. They're for the people that they never knew, that they would never meet. Like Martin Luther King Jr., August 1963, he was in Washington, D.C. saying, I have a dream.
Yeah.
They were fighting for equality in the workplace. We continue that movement today. Or Eleanor Roosevelt, again in Washington, D.C., taking the moment of just the heaviness of that time and looking for a way to create, social movements for good. And we do that social impact work today. So for me, quite oftentimes is seeing the opportunity to begin an issue advocacy campaign that might create a new law and tapping the shoulder of someone nearby to say, you can take this. Or just, in context of Find Your Fire is, teaching others how they can take that passion or that movement where they identify the passion and starting a movement in their community by, launching a nonprofit or passing a law, or even something as small as, collecting toiletries for the homeless.
Yeah.
There's so many ways that you can create social movements for good.
Well, and I've said this before. I have a 21-year-old son, and I have told him, and I've told other people, our 9/11 will be his COVID-19.
Yeah.
Where he will be able to tell his children and grandchildren where he was when the world shut down. The Great Reset, as we talked about earlier. I'll be able to tell my grandchildren where I was when I heard about the towers falling on September 11th, 2001. And so you're right. It is so important to keep those moments close to us and never forget them and remember how we felt. My last question for you is going to be this. Give the folks in this audience your biggest piece of intentional encouragement around turning moments into their life into movements of encouragement. Maybe the fire they need to start within them is beginning to encourage themselves more, to do bigger, greater things. So take that question for the next couple of minutes and just run with it.
Yes. Well, earlier in the podcast, I laid out the 4 ways that you can have your very own me set, just honoring that passion that's inside of you. And, to recap it, you have to breathe. You have to really visualize that good that you want to do in the world, or that change you want to happen inside of you. Then you will begin to attract the things that you need around you. And last, you have to transform. And those are the things that really make it happen. But Brian, I tell everyone, those are the 4 steps that you need to create that moment. But there are 4 things that I pack in my backpack. We're an invisible backpack every day. The first is faith. I believe that my grandparents and parents, they saw something in a neighborhood of Truman in Lafayette, Louisiana. They saw the opportunity to build a church, a Black Catholic church, and they raised their hand and they built that church because they were faithful people. Now, that church wasn't just about them serving as Christians and serving their community. It was, they saw something bigger than themselves. And so oftentimes when we're starting a movement, no matter what it is, that faith is tied to us believing in something bigger than ourselves. It could just be believing that our community is a special place. So faith is something that you need to carry with you every day. The second is fortitude. We have to know that there is always a way. We just have to find the way. And we can do that by turning obstacles into opportunities. So if we begin to look for the opportunities instead of getting caught up by obstacles, that way becomes more clear each and every day. The third one is we have to fail forward. And that's something that you and I talked a little bit about earlier. When we identify failures early and we don't let them stop us, we take that opportunity to become more innovative, to become more generative, to make our ideas bigger and better. Then we feel good about it. I tell people you should not have action review plans. Like when things go bad, we have these meetings where we look at what happened so it doesn't happen again. You should turn those into failure festivals, to celebrate what you've learned. And last is tie to grace, something that you and I talked a lot about earlier. And that is forgiveness for ourselves, not so much for others. We forgive others. We do that very well. And it's very simple. But forgiveness for ourselves, for when we need to say no, or when we just need to find more time for us to be still or to rest, or to say that this project isn't for us right now because we need to honor time with our family or honor time for ourselves. So faith, fortitude, a little failure, and forgiveness are things that will allow you to be intentional and encourage others around you each and every day.
That is so good. Terri, tell folks how they can connect with you, get your resources, get your book, things like that. How do folks connect with you?
TerriBWilliams.com is your one-stop shop for all the things. From mindful marks that will remind you how to honor that space and the time that you want when you're having a me set or creating a movement for social good and change. Those are on my website, to inspirational podcasts, where I talk to other leaders that have turned moments into movements, or people might even find some worksheets where they can get tools and strategies and tips to become a leader that turns a moment into a movement. So terribwilliams.com. And I always have tips and tools and stories on Instagram at Terri B. Williams or Movement Maker Collective, also on Instagram.
Awesome. Movement Maker Collective on Instagram. Movement Maker Collective on Instagram. I'm jotting that down so I can remember that as well too. And Terri is spelled Terribi Williams, WILLIAMS.com. TerriBWilliams.com, where you can find Terri Broussard Williams and her resources and things like that. What a joy this has been. Thank you for joining me today, Terri, on the Intentional Encourager podcast.
My thanks as always to producer Bryce Sexton and technical advisor Matt Means. And of course, the ultimate thanks goes to the Lord Jesus Christ, who provides intentional encouragement every day through his word. If you're not subscribed to the Intentional Encourager podcast, hit the subscribe button wherever you get podcasts so you don't miss an exciting episode where you can get encouraged and stay encouraged. And remember, anyone, anywhere, at any time, any place can be an intentional encourager.